Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Ben Uten, your choir director, your music director, and today I have a very unique privilege. As a matter of fact, I've had a very unique privilege all weekend long. As a matter of fact, it's actually lasted for years. The more I think about it, here at Christ Church in the music department, we have what we call community partners in the arts. These are arts groups, mostly performing ensembles, from throughout the community who take the opportunity to use our space for music lessons, for rehearsals, and for performances. And that's a wonderful thing for them because we don't charge them anything, and it's an especially wonderful thing for us because there is music going on throughout these halls all the time. It's extraordinary. And over the last few years, we've had the opportunity to do some collaborations beyond just what goes on here on campus. A few years ago, we had a collaboration between us and the Charlotte Chamber Choir, a new group in town where we did a concert with the Durflay Requiem. Last fall, we had the opportunity to perform with the Queens College Chamber Orchestra. And just this week, Friday night, we had the Charlotte Master Chorale, the ensemble that usually sings with a symphony, do an entire concert on their own as part of our celebration of the Christ Church Center for Wellbeing and Care. That celebration started in the fall when it opened, and we did Haydn's Mass in a Time of Anxiety, which is about when the world around you is zooey and you get all wound up. That was his response to that. Friday night, we had another kind of piece of music. It's very unique. It was a piece about grief and loss, and it was extraordinarily beautiful. And we're lucky because in the collaboration that we did with them, we invited the person who wrote the lyrics for that piece. And he not only wrote the lyrics, but he lived the lyrics. And so it's been an extraordinary opportunity to have Tony Silvestri with us this weekend to not only talk about that part of his life, but he is a medieval history teacher who has a class on pirates. After I heard so much about his teaching, I thought, the grief thing is just one part of a very magnificent and diverse personality. But today, in celebration of the Christ Church Center for Wellbeing and Care and what they offer, especially in terms of grief counseling, he's going to talk a little bit more about the piece that was performed on Friday night. If you didn't make it to the concert, no worries. He's a great communicator, and I think he's going to play a few pieces from it. But without further ado, let me introduce Tony Silvestri.
Thank you. All right. Can everybody hear me okay? Excellent. I've got some prepared remarks, but I'll just sort of go on and off the page with your indulgence. I want to thank the Christ Church community for inviting me here to give this forum, to Ben, the staff here, the pastors. Everybody has been so nice. This is my first trip to Charlotte outside the airport. And my first time in North Carolina, and so this was a wonderful introduction to me to this amazing community. Thank you to those of you who were at the concert on Friday night. It's hard to say, did you enjoy the concert? Or it's not a kind of work that you enjoy. You experience that work. I don't know how else to describe it. I've often been asked, what is this sacred veil? Is it an oratorio? Is it an octavo? Is it an opera? Is it a secular requiem? What is it? And my response to that is, it's a work of ministry. There are people who are grieving and who don't know how to talk about it. We as a culture, I think, don't do grief well. We sublimate it, we don't talk about it, it's uncomfortable, and I think we suffer for it as a culture. Other cultures do death rituals in a much more emotionally healthy way, but we don't. And so having a work like Sacred Veil reminds me, and it reminds us, that we as a culture need to talk about loss, and we need to share our human experience about loss. And that's sort of what my talk is too. And I'm really grateful that in addition to the concert, that many of you get this extra background and context. Just a show of hands, how many of you were at the concert on Friday night? Okay, just a handful, great. So I'm glad I have audio clips to share with you for some of the key moments. But I really would recommend that you go online. There are some beautiful performances online that you can stream and put your headphones on, get your Kleenex, and deep dive. So my talk today is called Lifting the Veil: Creativity and Healing the Wounds of Deep Loss. After suffering profound loss, we often find our lives out of balance, our energies blocked, our futures uncertain. Even the most intuitive and healthy of us can experience this tectonic shift in our reality and find it difficult to restore a sense of wholeness, let alone to get writing or creating again. I'm a poet, and I try to process what's happening in my life through poetry and through art, and this talk today is about how I couldn't do that and how grief blocks that process. Through the channeling of our creativity, in whatever form that takes, we can effect a healing transformation, the restoration of balance, and a renewed sense of control over our lives. In this presentation, my goal is to share insights gained from my 20-year journey as a poet, which provided the tools necessary for me to move through my own profound loss toward healing. I want to explore with you the power of creative expression to tap into the deepest part of our grief and pain and help us do the hard work of healing from traumatic loss. Now, if at any time during my presentation you have a question or a comment, put a pin in that, and be assured that we will have time to share afterwards. Part of the presentation is to answer your questions, and I'd love to have that conversation with you and to continue the conversations that I've had with so many people who were at the concert on Friday and whom I've sung with you guys this weekend. Additionally, that time can also be for your questions about lyric poetry, about my process as a poet, about my relationship with various composers, about musical works that I've been participating in, whatever you feel called to ask. So please be empowered to do that. And once again, I'd like to thank Christ Church for giving me this opportunity to share with you the fruits of this healing creative journey. This presentation is a work in progress. I've spoken about this topic on a couple of other occasions in various formats, and no doubt I'll speak of it again. But I find something new each time I revisit this journey, and I'm especially eager to hear your questions and comments and reactions. So, in 2004, my wife Julie was diagnosed with a particularly aggressive form of ovarian cancer, which was already spreading rapidly through her body. We tried everything from surgery and chemotherapy to alternative treatments, even faith healers. But ultimately, the disease took her life in 2005, just 2 days after her 36th birthday, devastating our little family and leaving me to raise our 2 small children alone. And because this is a faith community, maybe I'd like to speak a little bit about Julie's faith. And her faith was a great buoy to us. It was a great comfort to her, but it was also a source of trauma. And I risk telling you this story. She was convinced that she was going to be healed in a miraculous way, that God was going to do a great work in the world. And so she wanted to make her disease and her journey as public as possible so that the impact of God's miracle was going to be magnificent, right? Not in a vain way, but in a way to point directly to him. And so she created an email blog. This was in the days before Facebook. I'm sure if Facebook exists, she would have done it on that forum. But she would write an email update daily, sometimes weekly, and send it out to a list. And then those people would send it out, and then those people would send it out. And so people all over the world were praying for Julie. They were following her story. It became difficult for me as her husband, as her caregiver, to hold space, as they say now, for the possibility of her death. What were her wishes? What should we do about X, Y, or Z? We could not talk about that. She would not entertain it. She wouldn't suffer it, because God is going to heal me, and full stop. And so when the time did come, when things got really desperate, I took her to faith healers. We went to Benny Hinn, and Gloria Copeland put her hands on Julie's bald head to cast out the demons. It was a very weird and powerful experience for both of us. But ultimately, God's answer to her prayer was no, or silence, as I'll talk about later. So it was a difficult journey, and it made me angry at God, at the church. And it took me a very long time to process that and come to an understanding that God is sovereign and I am not. And I don't understand the answers to prayer, and all prayers are answered. Sometimes the answer is no. But the answer is yes. She was healed. She was healed completely, just on the other side of the veil, not on this side. So anyway, that's sort of an aside. Her death, of course, with 2 small children was like a nuclear bomb that detonated right in the middle of our lives. An earthquake whose epicenter was the deepest part of my heart. But eventually I was able to tap into the deepest parts of my grief and my creativity to rise out of the ruins her death left in its wake and emerge a healthier person. I still bear the scars of that loss and the trauma it caused in my life, but I've discovered an ever-renewing source of healing in the form of creative expression. And it's this relationship between trauma, creativity, and healing that I'd like to talk about and share with you today. I was both expecting and utterly unprepared for Julie to die that day in May. When it became clear that it was going to be that day, I left the hospital to pick up the children from school and preschool. They were 7 and 3 at the time. They deserved to be able to say goodbye to their mother, and she to them. Navigating the horrors and poignancies of that day was the most difficult, the most terrifying, but also the most sacred thing I've ever done. But in the days and weeks after that awful afternoon, I simply couldn't grieve. I had responsibilities. Our children needed me. There were details to attend to, arrangements to be made, messes to clean up. My teaching job was as demanding as a teaching job always is. Student essays don't grade themselves. I was busy, too busy to grieve the way I needed to. And like so many others before me, I just stuffed my grief into my briefcase. I kept calm and I carried on. This was my trauma, my loss, my particular pain. The death of one's life partner is but one of many kinds of trauma we experience in our lives, whether it's an illness, a difficult diagnosis, a debilitating injury, a breakup, a divorce, a betrayal, a loss of a job, an abrupt change in circumstances. These all can be experienced as trauma and can serve to wreck an otherwise smooth-sailing life. But it was not just the loss of my wife I had to mourn. It was the loss of the dreams we had, the plans we made for our future, all the milestones of our children's lives we would no longer be able to share together. The loss seemed like it was growing, metastasizing. A loss like this, so often a tectonic shift in one's life. It takes on a life of its own, and it can easily overwhelm, even destroy a person. As it turns out, I wasn't doing myself or my children or my family or my students any favors by sublimating my grief and getting on with my life, no matter how important it seemed to me at the time to stay the course. I grew unhealthy in many ways, and all forward motion in my life stopped. I felt ashamed to move on, a sort of survivor's guilt. Julie had wanted to be a mother more than anything in the world. It wasn't right that I would be raising our children without her. Cancer is bad for anyone at any age, but to take a young mother away from her children, that was just cruel. I was consumed with rage at the disease, at God, at Julie for leaving me. I began to see myself as the victim. Why did this happen to me? And then the crushing guilt for making this about me, about my pain. I lashed out. I said things I shouldn't have to the people that I love. I began to redefine the world as a place that was out to get me, that was unfair to me alone. My friends, this is a dangerous trap, a sense of dis-ease with the world that leads to a perpetual victim mentality, a life lived in the deficit mode of thinking. It was comforting in a dark way to think about the world that it was out to get me, but this way of thinking is ultimately dangerous. I gained weight. I made unhealthy choices, even self-destructive ones. I couldn't see the blessings that remained in my life. I only saw the lack. There were weeks on end when I would simply stand in the kitchen, unable to act, unable to feel, unable to process what was going on around me. All I could do was stand there and stare at the dishes in the sink, arrange and rearrange piles of unopened mail on the counter, stare into the fridge. For a whole year, I simply existed, but only barely, in a kind of stupor, like a zombie, a shade of the person I once was. Ostensibly, I was the sole caregiver for my two kids, but in reality, they were caring for themselves because I simply wasn't there for them. I wasn't even there for myself. I simply wasn't there at all. I existed in the fog of grief, in that sense of helplessness and victimhood and passivity that can become, and was for me, all-consuming and self-perpetuating. These are powerful, dark energies, and if left unchecked, they can slowly destroy a person from within, very much like cancer, actually. And these energies are particularly destructive to the spirit of a creative person. My work as a poet writing for choral composers had only just begun to take on steam, but it came to an abrupt halt during Julie's illness and after her death. My creativity was completely blocked, inspiration was suffocated, my voice as a poet was silenced. The first step in my recovery was the decision to quit my teaching job in Los Angeles, sell our home, and move to Kansas to be closer to my family. It was terrifying. A terrifying prospect for me to walk away from a high-paying job at a prestigious school, leave behind my closest friends and the life I had made for myself. But I had to escape the negative energy that was threatening to swallow me up. I agonized over this decision. Was it the right thing for me? Was it the right thing for my kids? Was it going to be just more trauma for them and for me? Would I be able to find a job in Kansas? These uncertainties were occupying all my consciousness as I accompanied a group of ninth graders on an exchange trip to Italy in the spring, the year after Julie's death. Now, I brought these students to Assisi as part of that trip. And as we stood on the large lawn in front of the Basilica of San Francesco, I shared with them the story of St. Francis. And I heard in my own voice the answer to the question which had haunted me that whole year. The story of this man who risked everything and walked away from a comfortable life as a merchant to listen to an inner voice calling him to make a change resonated with me in a visceral way while I was telling that story, and I began to cry. My students were alarmed. Dr. Silvestri, are you okay? We eventually moved inside the basilica where we stood under Giotto's magnificent frescoes, many of which had been recently damaged in a serious earthquake. These images of the life of St. Francis spoke to me in ways that they never had before, as fragile symbols of beauty, damaged but still powerful in their brokenness and vulnerability. Like St. Francis, I could answer the call and remake my life. And like the frescoes of Giotto, I too could be damaged, cracked, and still communicate truth and beauty in a powerful way. If I did this, I would be okay. As soon as I returned from the trip, I resigned from my job and put the house on the market. I moved to my new home in Lawrence, Kansas on an early day in July, one of the hottest and most humid days I had ever experienced in my life. I instantly regretted my decision to blow up what remained of my life and move there, if I'm going to be honest. And at first, nothing changed. I just changed the location, as I now mourned the loss of my home, my friendships, and a job I loved, in addition to the losses I was already reeling from. The inertia, the stupor, the standing around not knowing what to do, that continued now just in a new kitchen. But something else started to happen. I looked up. I noticed the incredible skies in Kansas. I noticed the abundance of life, all the green and growing things all around me. The authenticity and no-nonsense spirit of Kansans were in stark contrast to the pretensions and illusions of Los Angeles. I was compelled to take photographs, especially of the sky. My phone has about 2,500 photographs of the sky. That creative part of my spirit that had lain dormant for more than a year began to awaken. And my best friend, Eric Whitacre, the composer for Sacred Veil, encouraged me to write poetry about my grief, but I resisted. Perhaps I knew it was a third rail that I dare not touch, not yet. But another abiding creative interest of mine is painting, especially sacred icons in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. Not long after I moved to Kansas, I enrolled in an icon painting workshop that was being given in Kansas City, and I chose to use the experience as a sort of grief meditation, writing a version of a very rare icon, the image of the angel of the holy silence of God. There's an image of the icon there, but I actually brought it with me, and I'd love to just pass it around. I would love for you to hold it and look at it and engage with it and give your energy to it. Maybe, Ben, if I could give that to you and you could pass it around. The painting of an icon, I was drawn to this image, this particular icon, to its form, its image, but also to its meaning. I imagined all of our desperate prayers to God for Julie's healing, the pleas of thousands of prayer warriors all over the world who had mobilized on her behalf. I imagined that all these prayers were delivered to the throne of God and were then entrusted to the safekeeping of a special angel, an angel who embodied the utter silence with which God would answer those prayers. I imagined that these prayers were precious to God, even though his answer was ultimately going to be no, but that his heart broke for Julie so much that he created this angel just to hold the prayers in her heart forever in silence. Now, the painting of an icon involves putting down layer after layer of pigment, sometimes as many as 1,000 layers, painted in silence. The paint is raw pigments mixed with egg yolk and water, laid out in sort of transparent glazes, layer by layer. You paint in silence with a candle. It's a prayerful exercise with intense focus. The artist draws the image and can imagine what the finished icon will look like. But then the carefully drawn image is plunged into darkness. Your beautiful drawing is covered over with muddy green proplasmos. It's not difficult for me to see the parallels here, as the carefully drawn image of my future with Julie had also been covered with earth. Bending over the icon board, literally slathering dirt onto my drawing, I was transported back to Julie's burial, looking down into her open grave, thinking of her body wrapped in white linen and all the hopes and dreams and plans we had together as we all threw shovelfuls of earth onto her coffin. Now, when I painted the icon that's being passed around, I didn't think to take process photographs of it. I wasn't in that space, but I did later paint this this painting of Christ, and I did mark the different stages of it, so that's why you're seeing a different icon. Now, an icon at this stage looks like it's ruined, making the artist question everything about the process. It takes a long time for the painting to emerge again from this darkness as layer after layer of lighter and lighter colors begin to illuminate the image from within. It's in the painting of the face that the deepest connection between the painter and the subject of the icon develops, and the intentionality of the constant prayer that painting an icon represents is most intense. When painting the face, each layer of transparent color can have a profound effect on the expression. A face that is motherly and kind one moment can instantly become stern or aloof with the slightest wash of pigment. It was like a conversation. And as I revealed my joys, sorrows, sources of shame, fears, insecurities, and gratitude, the angel responded with a hardening or softening of her expression, all while keeping her enigmatic silence. As her face changed, I was reminded of Julie's changing face, as her treatments led to occasional days of plumping, and ultimately as the course of her disease led in those last few weeks to that skeletal emaciation that so often reveals the waste of a person that is cancer. By the end of the process, the face became an amalgam of Julie's and the angel's faces, not necessarily in the way it looked, but in the energy of intention focused in its creation and development. The icon became more than a holy image. It was sort of a memento mori, allowing me to hold on to a little bit of the spirit of my lost love, a homing beacon leading me back to that place and time. I was writing the icon as a window into heaven and seeing Julie's face there. As the days of the workshop passed, hour upon hour, silent work hunched over the icon board, focusing all my intention prayerfully on the subject of the silence of God. I found that I was adding layers to the icon. I was peeling away layers of blocked energy in my own spirit. As I got closer and closer to why I had chosen this image, I began to cry, sobbing there in the painting workshop, adding my tears to the egg tempera. The angel with Julie's face staring back at me in her silence helped me to begin to express the inexpressible, unlocking the deepest parts of me that I had hidden away from my own protection. The experience of painting this icon was a pivotal moment in my grief process in which I began to discover the power of creativity to unbind, transform, and heal one's deepest pain. I realized that the image I was focusing on was only a small part of the effect, but it was more simply the intention itself that was the source of the healing energy. This revelation became the source of inspiration for me as I was finally able to transition back into writing poetry and linking the writing of poetry to the processing of my grief. All this excavating was hard work, but once that work was underway and the dark places in my psyche began to be exposed again to the light, I could apply the same process with poetry that I had learned from painting the icon. Writing about my grief, taking moments of pain and joy and memory and heartache, and encapsulating them in the intentional words of a poem, created space slowly in my spirit for healing, for the planting of new seeds, new dreams, new light emerging from the darkness. The poems I tried to write about grief before this revelation of intentionality were sterile. They were detached. They were inauthentic. I want to share with you the earliest poem that I wrote very shortly after Julie's death. Reluctantly, I might add, I wrote it at the urging of my best friend Eric, who thought wisely that writing a poem would help me through my grief. This first poem ended up to being completely cerebral, an intellectual exercise on the topic of grief rather than a true expression of something authentic. I wrote it from that pure, raw, emotional place of 12th century Latin irregular trochaic octameter, as one does, right? Rosa tempus conteret suaviter florescere, ita sua vari occultissima patescere, simule amincipis subtiliter conoscere, moritur. Once A rose opens and you just get to know it, it dies. Clearly, I wasn't ready to go there yet. It's a good poem, but it isn't connected to the deepest part of my grief. It merely skates on the surface. But it's too cool. It's all brain and no heart. Once I began to write from a place of real vulnerability and intentional emotion, the poetry took on a life of its own, and composers noticed. I have since been able to share more and more of my deepest reflections about my life with Julie, her illness and death, my grief, and the recovery and healing I have experienced in my poetry. Normally, in my process as a lyric poet, I attempt to write poems that are universal, usable by any composer or sung by any kind of performing ensemble. Avoiding the personal has become a hallmark of my craft. But this deeper work required me to write about myself, about my personal feelings and struggles. I didn't think composers would be interested in such personal, limited lyrics, but I was wrong. I want to share with you one such collaboration, which was really the first successful deeper dive into vulnerability that connected me more fully with that healing power and with a new composer who was just discovering my poetry at that time. Susan Labar asked me for a poem about love, and I gave her one of my standard works. It was a universalized reflection on the 4 Greek words for love: eros, philia, storge, and agape. She wrote back saying it was a nice poem, but asking if I had anything more vulnerable, more authentic, more personal. And so I grabbed the opportunity to dig a little deeper, and I created for her a poem called Love, Then and Still. While I attended the premiere of this work with the composer, I was moved to tears, and I knew this was a powerful way forward in my own grieving process. I'd like to share with you Susan's setting of this poem, and you can read along as you hear the audio for it. I'm a very, very lucky poet indeed. I get to share my poetry not only on the page, but also accompanied by custom-made soundtracks by the greatest composers. That's how people get to experience my poetry. It's an amazing thing. And Susan's a wonderful person, and I've written many other pieces with her. Here's another poem I wrote, this time for a Norwegian composer. I've written many pieces with Kim Arnesen. He asked for something that spoke about married love. This was for a church commission, and so I turned to the familiar marriage rite, would be familiar to us, and then I added some personal layers to it. In the presence of God, I choose you to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and cherish so long as we both shall live. All this do we vow and promise as we begin our journey on this, our joyful, happy day. The vows we speak today in joy by time and trials are tested, but love abides in good times and in bad until that saddest day when one of us must close the other's eyes and say goodbye. Too soon, my love, too soon. Your sickness and your health took the better from the worst till death parted us. Too soon, my love, too soon. I loved loving you. I cherish having cherished you. My honor ever was and is to honor you until we meet again. In many ways, the sacred veil is my keeping of that promise. When we're married and we make that vow, we don't think of the end, of the fulfillment of that vow. The choral piece he wrote for this poem was very sweet and poignant and very heart-tugging, as his music tends to be. And the experience pushed me a little bit deeper. Another composer wanted a poem about eternity, and so I reflected. It had been 10 years since Julie's death, and I had only just begun to express myself in poetry. And so I wanted to write kind of the 35,000-foot view of what I had learned and what I had experienced with Julie's death. After all this time, I had come back to a relationship with God and with an understanding of eternity, and I came up with this idea, or influenced by something that I had read about this veil, the sacred veil between this world and the next, between finitude and infinity. And when someone crosses over that veil, either in death or in birth, right? They come from eternity into this experience. That is a sacred act. And when you're missing your loved ones, the veil is right here, and your loved one is standing just on the other side of the veil. They're so close to you. And so I sent to Stuart Turnbull, a British composer, for an art song, this poem that became the first movement of the sacred veil. And I had this poem, and after a couple months after I'd written it, my Aunt Joan passed away, and I traveled back to Los Angeles for the family funeral and for all of the things that we had as a family. And I stayed with Eric Whitacre in his home. And before I left for the funeral, I took out a copy of this poem and I left it on his piano. And then I went to our family things, and when I came back later that evening, Eric had already composed the entirety of the first movement of Sacred Veil. He said never in his career had he been called to immediately write music. And if you study the score, all the other movements are all encapsulated in that one movement. So he already envisioned that this was a larger work, and he and I began this conversation of what do we do with this? Can you, he asked, write this work? Should we do this? And we both agreed that we both needed to do it, that the world needed to have the sacred veil, that to honor Julie's memory, we needed to do it. But it was going to be a very difficult process because I really hadn't unpacked my grief. Writing the sacred veil took 2 years. And most of that 2 years was me just pearl clutching, waiting to open the box of stuff and read all of Julie's email blogs and read her journals and revisit, dredge up all of that, scratch that scar on my heart and feel that pain all over again. And I kind of didn't want to. And Eric just sort of lovingly, brotherly, in a pastoral way, just sort of helped me be patient and encourage me to do this work. when the tone of the sacred veil turns dark, the first half of it is this beautiful expression of our love and our getting to know one another and the birth of our kids, and it's the happy part, right? Imagine the 8mm shaky, grainy family film, a home movie version of a wonderful life with someone. That's the whole first half of the sacred veil. But then the tone of the sacred veil turns dark as we learn of Julie's diagnosis. Anyone who's experienced cancer knows that awful feeling during that meeting with the doctor when you first hear your diagnosis. The world just falls away, and the words of the doctor become like the Charlie Brown teacher, wah, 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 wah. And you're thinking, what am I gonna do? Who's gonna raise the kids? What about my dreams? Who's gonna feed the cat? The plants are gonna die. What about this dream? What about that dream? And in a way, I can imagine it very difficult for the doctors too, to tell somebody that they have cancer. And so there's this diagnostic vocabulary that the doctors use in their communication with patients. And I always thought maybe that's a wall to protect them from the emotional heartache that they have to endure. You separate from yourself at that moment, as if time stops. You try to process what you're hearing. And for this moment in our journey, I basically took all the words directly from Julie's medical records over the course of her disease in order to recreate the terror and confusion of that moment. And Eric's music lifts this terrifying moment into the realm of the sacred. The Sacred Veil was premiered in 2019, and we had great plans for it, and then of course COVID hit, and so all the performances were canceled and the recording had to be done masked, but now groups are beginning to program it, and I'm so glad that it can be shared here as well, and that many of you had the experience of that. So this is a movement called I'm Afraid, and this is where the 8mm family, the home movie, turns into something dark. And I'd like to play for you just a little bit of this movement. I want to be mindful of the time. I'm afraid we've found something, is what the doctors said. So you can hear a little bit of the terror, the fear. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. The horror of that moment as the choir almost chants like oracle priests and priestesses, the doom of a person. And it becomes robotic. It becomes sort of sterile and clinical. I've had people come up, women who had ovarian cancer, come up to me after concerts and say how profound it was for her to see and hear the words of her diagnosis taken right from her medical record sung in a sacred place. It elevates that pain to beauty, and it helps in that healing process. The sacred veil goes on. There's a movement, You Rise, I Fall, that talks about the moment of Julie's death. And I'm just going to show you the poetry for You Rise, I Fall. We won't be able to hear any part of it. As all movements of this work, Eric and I wanted to just strip it down to the barest essential communication. This was the first poem that we wrote together. This was where we started. We wanted to start at the darkest part of Sacred Veil so that I could get it out of the way and then begin to write the rest of the movements. Listening to your labored breath, your struggle ends as mine begins. You rise, I fall. Fading yet already gone, what calls you I cannot provide. You rise, I fall. Broken, with a heavy hand, I reach to you and close your eyes. You rise, I fall. It's a 9-minute aleatoric murmuration of grief and pain and anguish, and then the rising redemption, and then back to the anguish again. It's an amazing dialogue between what's happening as one person crosses the veil and another person has to stay on this side. And then the sacred veil ends with this beautiful benediction where Julie's spirit is welcomed into eternity. The sacred veil did so much for my own healing. It pushed me through a whole bunch of dark places and allowed me to write again. Other composers have asked me to write about the spiritual dimension. Eric didn't want to touch on the spiritual dimension of eternity, yet other composers asked me to do that, and I have many works like that as well. I've been able to process a whole bunch of this grief in creativity, and I would encourage you to do the same. Leaning into a creative project while focusing one's intention on the subject of your pain, the emotions surrounding your loss and trauma, this acts like a powerful spell, an alchemy of spirit and intention and practice that forces the pain to move from the darkness into the light where it can be seen and named and respected and contained and ultimately released. For me, it was painting and poetry. For others, it might be planting a garden, carving into wood or stone, molding clay, sewing a quilt, kneading dough, hosting a party, composing or playing music, writing a memoir, shaping one's body, or deepening one's spiritual development. Whichever medium of creativity one chooses, the key is in the intention, the focus on the source and feelings of loss. The more vulnerable I allowed myself to become, the more meaningful the art I produced, and the stronger and more restored to wholeness I found myself becoming. Grief or loss or trauma are not evils that need to be exorcised. They are parts of you, just as scars remain after an injury that is healed. Think of them as wells of authenticity and humanity and emotion that can become the foundations of things of beauty. By using these powerful dark emotions as the raw material for art, we do the work of transforming our pain into beauty and translating our grief into energy enough to heal ourselves as well as others. I want to thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you, and in the minutes that we have, I would love to be able to speak about anything you'd like, if any of you have any questions for me. I know it's close to the time we're supposed to end, so. I have this tendency, you ask a college professor to talk and they talk for 50 minutes and then stop. Anything. Well, it's been my pleasure to speak with you today. Oh, question.
Thank you so much for being here, and a lot of what you're saying resonates, at least with me, and I'm sure with many other people. I was writing my questions, so I couldn't forget it, but I got half of it.
Good planning.
So something that touched me, as you process your grief through your creativity, and you heal each aspect of your grief, you said you're asked to compose more, commissioned to write more.
Yeah.
do you go back to that same place? Do you approach it in a different way? I guess my question is, can you retouch that same after you've healed, or
Yeah.
do you approach it from a new light?
That's a great question. And we are constantly being remade. You can never step in the same river twice, as they say, or never see the same painting twice. You're a different person. And so every time I write a poem, it's that new version of me that writes a poem. And I read some of my older work, and I have to remember, who was that guy? What was that guy going through? And so in a way, people ask me, what's it like to listen to Sacred Veil over and over? And I get to revisit that lost part of myself. I'm not that man anymore. I grew as a part of that process. My grief is still there. It's never gotten any smaller. I've just gotten a lot bigger around it. And so now when I'm asked to write, I write from that new perspective. Unless, of course, the composer says, go back to that dark place and write from that place. And then I try to conjure it. But that's sort of difficult because I don't want to conjure it. I'm not that person anymore. That poem won't be authentic to who I am right now. If that makes sense. So thank you. That's a great question. Maybe one more as our closer is coming up. I'm getting the hook here.
Where is your poetry available
Yes.
independent of music?
Yes, I have a website that has many of my poems on it, charlesanthonysilvestri.com. Actually, the last slide, if you want to put up the last slide, it has all my contact information. But I have a book of poetry published called A Silver Thread, which is 20 years worth of my lyric poetry for various composers all gathered into one book. I have two poems. Probably my two most famous and most performed texts are Sleep by Eric Whitacre and Leonardo Dreams of His Flying Machine, also by Eric Whitacre. And many choirs have performed this, and both of those works have been made into children's books. They were illustrated and published as children's books. And so there's many pathways to reaching people. The Sleep book, for example, is used by grief counselors, especially counseling children whose parents have died. And the artist knew the story of Julie and changed the illustrations for Sleep to be a kind of soundtrack for Julie's passing as I wish it had occurred. And so the illustrations represent that and allow a way in for counselors to talk about grief to kids. I also love that they're children's books because a language arts teacher can use it for reading time and then play the choral music in class. And the music teacher can use it for reading time and then get to talk about choral music as well. So it's nicely able to be used in that way. Thank you for your wonderful questions, for your patience, for your hospitality to me. It's been a wonderful weekend experience for me, and I can't wait to come back to Charlotte. Thank you.
Tony, thank you so much on behalf of Christ Church and everyone who was there Friday night and everyone who's here and everyone who's going to watch this. Thank you for your vulnerability, for being open and honest about the grief and the experience that you've had. I want to take just a moment to add a plug for community in grief. I see a lot of people here who I know have suffered deep grief and tragic loss. It's one of those common threads of humanity that kind of bind us all together. And it's one of the great joys of being in a church like this and a community like this is that we don't have to do any of this alone, that we can do it here as a community. And so I would be remiss if I didn't mention we have a Living with Grief and Hope series coming up in March 10th, Mondays in the middle of the day. It'll be 4 Mondays. So if this has sparked something in you or if this has touched into that well of grief for you, for a loss that you may have suffered a while ago, I'd really encourage you to reach out to one of our counselors or to sign up for our Living with Grief and Hope class because you are not alone. Your experience may be unique to you, but the experience of grief we all share and hold together. So thank you so much for reflecting that in all that you do.
Thank you.
Yeah. I would love to close with a prayer. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Dear Lord, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for Tony and for Julie and their family, for the blessing of life. Give you thanks for the gifts of creativity you have given Tony. We could all join him in his experience of grief and loss, and in so doing, touch our own experience of grief. Please be with us wherever we are. We are in grief at this moment and sadness at this moment. Comfort us. If we are in joy at this moment, celebrate with us. If we find ourselves receiving only the silence of God, help us feel you, enduring it, holding it, bearing it with us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you all.